of course, it's wonderful to look at this sea of really rather friendly faces. And I must say, when Stephen Hodder telephoned me and told me that I was going to receive the gold medal, I was gratified, of course, but I soon realized that I would have to sing for my medal. And this is it. Unfortunately, I did not have the resource which any working architect who is awarded the honor enjoys. That of being able to show, comment on, and perhaps even justify their own buildings and projects. Since my achievement in that field, though I suppose it could be called respectable, it is really pretty exiguous. My very first project was a nightclub which had the distinction of being the first London discotheque and perhaps the only fur-lined interior in the world. It was called Whips. It had a famous or notorious landlord, and who died almost immediately afterwards, not because of this, I hasten to say. But as I say, it had that distinction, and it became, after his death, it became a quite different institution. It became the Ad Lib, which was very much a 60s hangout where both the Beatles and the Stones went, and there was even a third group who used to come, and people used to say, this is the Beatles and this is the Stones and this is the Who, and that's who they became. So I have, though it's not a great work, it has a certain amount of at least notoriety, if not distinction. I then did a certain amount of industrial design, including some light fittings for an Italian manufacturer. This is a drawing, and this is the object itself. I did some more light fittings in a public space. This is in Dorking. And I went in for 1 or 2 competitions, including that for Liverpool Cathedral. And then, in partnership with Mark Livingston, we designed a housing project in Chelsea, near Church Street, which had the distinction of being listed just before it was completely wrecked by its present owners. Sometime later came a commission from B.J. Archer, who I think is in this room, and who was organizing an exhibition of follies. This is a drawing, in fact, by Rumiko Handa, who I know is in this room, for a bronze and marble building. All of this hardly justifies the great honor which marks me out today, and which is almost a provocation, since much of my work has been spent not in designing buildings, but in teaching as well as in chronicling and criticizing the work of my predecessors. Since I believe that, as a historian, the true work is not chronicling, but above all is critical work. And my criticism has extended to the work of my contemporaries, who have nevertheless very generously rewarded me my carping profession by this distinction. And it is the word profession which brought to mind this rather curious publication, now more than a century old. It appeared in 1892, whose title, A Profession or an Art, I have purloined for my talk, because it seems to sum up a question which much exercised my elders and betters of the time, and has still not gone away. Now that the offices and practices of yesteryear have become firms or even businesses, and partners are called directors, we seem to be resigned to the notion that the design and making of buildings is no longer a profession, but a trade or a commerce. And this book, which title page I show you, was brought together rather hurriedly by a group animated by the leading British architect of the time, Richard Norman Shaw, whom I show you painted by his friend John Calcott Horsley, who in fact was responsible for many of his early commissions. The book was conceived as a protest against the professionalizing of architecture, the mother art. Shaw was then the figure of towering authority. He had designed many palatial private houses, as well as prominent official buildings, such as Scotland Yard, and sometimes after this episode would produce the Piccadilly Hotel, and this involved the remodeling of the quadrant of Regent Street. At the same time, his work is being published not only in this country but also abroad, and to some extent, some historians think that the shingle style in the United States, which was so important there, was really a kind of improvisation on Shaw's published drawings. Anyhow, Britain had been a bit sluggish about this business of registering and certifying architects and setting up a professional organization. But it exercised architects in Europe as well as in North America. In America, it was first handled by separate states, so there was no unified registration system. But in France, as you might expect, such matters were centralized very early. It started already under Louis XIV, and under Napoleon, the system of the École Polytechnique and the École des Beaux-Arts channeled state patronage of painting and sculpture as well as architecture to the deserving whom the government really approved of. In Germany, on the other hand, the different kingdoms and cities had parallel systems, advanced in some, such as Baden in Bavaria, but perhaps most organized in Prussia. This is the new Bauschule, which Karl Friedrich Schenkel built just after 1830. It became the Bauakademie, and Edward Gertner painted it about 30 years after it was built. It was built to house the central government-sponsored building school of the Prussian state. This is all rather more powerful than what happened in this country. The Institute of Architecture united various clubs and societies in 1834. The Royal Charter came in 1837, when it became the Royal Institute. But though it boasted a splendid library, it never did open a school. So that training in Britain worked through the old system of articled clerks, much like that of lawyers. It was supplemented by evening classes at the Royal Academy until the Architectural Association began instruction after 1847. The universities did not really offer full architectural teaching for a long time, even though Thomas Donaldson was appointed Professor of Architecture at University College in 1841. Cambridge had to wait until 1912, when one of the signatories of the book, it doesn't appear on the title page, Edmund Pryor became Slade Professor in Cambridge with the mission of establishing a school of architecture, which indeed he succeeded. And though the school wasn't very important in the English architectural system until much later. Most contributors to this book were also members of the clubby Arts and Crafts Guild. In the book, they proudly declared themselves either Royal Academicians or university graduates. And in the epigraph on the title page, which you can read, they protest, perhaps a bit stuffily, out of Horace's poetic art, without an abundance of talent, I see no profit in study, nor any advantage in genius left raw, which suggests Adolf Lowe's definition of the architect as a mason who knows his Latin. All that agitation was provoked by a parliamentary bill, not the first one either, that would make architecture an examinable and registered profession, like the law and medicine. The bill had been introduced in the House of Commons in March 1891. It was badly framed. It was opposed by the Institute itself, and it never even got a second hearing. So in fact, the agitation which continued as it were in a vacuum. But it did continue. There was a book, then there was a letter of protest signed by 4 architects and 2 painters. One was Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema. This is a picture of a Roman sculptor's studio by him. He's really usually associated with pictures of girls in flimsily and vaguely antique dresses, but he was actually passionately interested in architecture, and this is one painting where he shows himself involved in questions of environment, and this is a rather strange painting of Phidias showing his friends the Parthenon Frieze. You notice the frieze is coloured, unlike the elegant marbles, which of course are represented on it. The other painter involved in all this was Sir Edward Burne-Jones, Last Dream of King Arthur, and both of them were involved in yet another piece of agitation, a long letter to the Times protesting against the idea of architecture's registration, which was signed by 53 people, by architects who were not members of the RIBA, architects who were RIBA members, and by interested people, including, of course, Burne-Jones and Alma-Tadema. But also, people rather unexpectedly, people outside that circle, Walter Crane and William Morris. All of these people were bound by a political belief in militant socialism. This is Walter Crane, an engraving for a political pamphlet, who saw art and architecture certainly as an accessory to their political agitation. This letter was sent also to the beleaguered president of the Institute, Norman Shaw's old acquaintance, John McVicar Anderson. But for all the agitation, the Registration Act was not passed. In fact, it didn't become law until 1931. And the right to the title of architect was not then vested in the Institute, but a registration council, which has since become the Architects' Registration Body, and whose copyright, as it were, on the title of architect, I believe is again in question. But that is another chapter and another lecture. As for the book, most of the architects' signatories were associates or had been articled pupils of Shaw, and were also members of the Clubby Art Workers Guild. It was from Shaw's office and home that the agitation started, and Shaw had an awkward relation with the Institute, since he claimed that the grouping of architects in a separate corporation isolated them from their artist peers, the sculptors and painters, the company which their presence in the Royal Academy ensured. though the truth be told, there were only 7 architects amongst the 82 academicians at the time of this whole agitation. For all that, Shaw refused the gold medal twice. First, when it was offered to him as a pacifier in 1894, just after this book was published, when it went paradoxically to another painter, Lord Leighton, while the second time he was curtly informed of the award when his old acquaintance and occasional associate, Sir Ernest George, was president of the RIBA. At that point, Shaw turned it down grumpily and a bit churlishly, and his son Robert told his biographer Andrew Saint that he would have accepted it if the second time had he been more courteously approached. Anyway, it went again to a painter with whom he had been associated in the protests, the same Lawrence Alma Tadema whose pictures I have just showed you. Now, Shaw was in fact the second person to refuse the honor. The first to turn it down had been John Ruskin. This is a portrait of him by Hubert van Herkomer, which was painted just after Herkomer succeeded Ruskin as late professor at Oxford. And Ruskin thought it best likeness that had been made of him. It was in 1874, about the time this painting was done, that his friend Sir George Gilbert Scott was president and made the offer to Ruskin in a letter which reached him in Rome. He mulled over it, but after a while wrote refusing it, citing as the reason a whole list of architectural vandalisms, mostly Italian, beginning with the neglect of the Bragacci tomb in the small church in Naples. There it is. It's by Donatello and Michelozzo. It is a very distinguished piece of work, but the fact that it had been dirty and neglected was not the fault of the RIBA. So, being an old friend of Scott, Scott appealed to Ruskin to withdraw his objection, but the lofty-minded irreconcilable, as the RIBA journal of the time called him, was not to be moved. Now this was rather awkward because the award had already been approved by the palace, and the palace insisted that they weren't going to be left with a blank. So in place of Ruskin, the medal went to the greatest Goth of the time, George Edmund Street, who of course was much admired by Ruskin, and this is his most conspicuous work, and perhaps the most conspicuous work of the Gothic revival, the Law Courts in the Strand. Street had been a towering figure, as towering as Shaw in his time, and his pupils had included William Morris, the same Edward Ben Jones whose picture I've just shown you, who had started off as an architect, Philip Webb, who was Morris's most closest associate, and even Norman Shaw himself. Ruskin was offered the medal again, and for his second refusal, he cited another list of Italian misdeeds, as well as, curiously enough, the naughty practice, as he saw it, of architects being paid by commission on contracts. He thought that architects should be paid by fees. And it was very odd that she should pick on that, because Sir Christopher Wren had been paid by commission on contracts for doing the city churches. So it was really not an innovation. And again, there was a bit of peevishness about it all, because Ruskin did say that had it been offered to him 20 years earlier, after he had written The Stones of Venice, he would have accepted it. So there was a bit of offense and awkwardness about it. And it came rather oddly from Ruskin, because for that matter, he wasn't at all averse from a bit of deference. And he wrote about this time, about the time when he refused the medal the second time, in a kind of confessional book after his election to the Oxford chair. In many things, I am a reverse of a conservative, but I still want to keep the fields of England green and her cheeks red, and that girls should be taught to curtsy, and that boys should take their hats off when a professor or other dignified person passes by. Now, it was at this time that he assumed the title professor, and he was generally known as the professor even to his friends. So there is a double edge to these remarks.